The pre-dawn gloom hangs over Rome, March 222 AD. The air in the barracks of the Praetorian Guard is thick and heavy, smelling of sour wine, filth, cheap lamp oil, and the sharpest scent of all, collective animal fear. Here, in the military heart of the empire, the fate of the world is being decided, not with gilded standards and trumpet calls, but in a squalid, panicked rush. Somewhere inside, perhaps in a small storeroom or even a latrine, crammed into a large chest, sits Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, the invincible, the pious, the fortunate, the high priest of the invincible sun god. He is only 18, but in his 4 years of rule, he has collected more titles and roles than any of his predecessors. He was an emperor, the high pontiff of Rome, but above all, he was the living incarnation of his Syrian god, Elagabalus. He was a god. And in recent months, to the horror and confusion of the entire city, he demanded to be called not Lord, but Lady. He appeared in public in silks, with painted eyes and a wig, declaring himself an empress. And now this goddess, this emperor, this young priest, whose ecstatic dances before a sacred black stone were meant to bring Rome a new era of prosperity, trembles in the dark, listening to the roar of the crowd. It is the roar of his own soldiers, the same men who just 4 years ago carried him on their shields, seeing him as the son of the deified Caracalla. Now, they are hunting him, to kill him. How could this have happened? How could a young man, raised to serve a god, ascend to the pinnacle of the world, the Roman throne, only to turn his divine mission into the most notorious scandal in the history of the Eternal City? In this pre-death darkness, in the stench of a barracks latrine, lies the central paradox of his life, the story of how the most fervent faith can give birth to the greatest sacrilege, and how an attempt to lift Rome to his God's heavens instead cast the prophet himself into the abyss. To understand how the very idea of a Syrian priest taking the throne was possible, one must see the Roman Empire of the early 3rd century, not as the indestructible monolith of textbooks, but as a tired, wounded colossus whose internal supports were rotten to the core. The era of the Antonines, the golden age of humanity according to the historian Gibbon, was long gone. The Severan dynasty, founded by the African Septimius Severus, was held together by a single principle he left to his sons: stick together, enrich the soldiers, and ignore everyone else. His son, Caracalla, took this advice too literally. He murdered his brother Getta, lavished gifts on the army, but ruled with such cruelty that terror became commonplace. In 217 AD, this bloody tyrant was assassinated in a plot organized by his Praetorian prefect, Marcus Opellius Macrinus. This was an unprecedented break in tradition. For the first time, a man not of the senatorial class, but an equestrian, a former lawyer who had risen through administrative talent rather than nobility or military valor, took the throne. For the Senate, it was a humiliation. For the army, it was a betrayal, as Macrinus, unlike Caracalla, was in no hurry to shower the legions with gold. The empire was frozen in a fragile equilibrium. Macrinus tried to stabilize the finances and made a clumsy peace with Parthia, but he lacked the main thing, the sacred authority of a dynasty. He was an upstart, a placeholder on a throne still warm from the predecessor he had murdered. And in this atmosphere of universal discontent and political vacuum, on the eastern fringes of the empire, in the Syrian city of Emesa, one woman saw her chance. This was Julia Maesa, sister of the late Empress Julia Domna, aunt of the murdered Caracalla. Exiled from Rome to her hometown by Macrinus, she had no intention of accepting her loss of power. She had gold, connections, and most importantly, 2 grandsons with the blood of the Severans in their veins. The chessboard was set for a new game, and Julia Maisa was about to play for the ultimate stake, the entire Roman Empire. At the heart of this grand conspiracy was not Rome with its Forum and Colosseum, but the ancient Syrian city of Emesa, center of worship for the powerful god Elagabal, or as he was known locally, Elagabalus. This was not an anthropomorphic god of the Greco-Roman pantheon, but something far more ancient and primal. A black conical stone, a meteorite, fallen from the heavens and considered the physical embodiment of the deity. It was the center of a solar cult that blended Phoenician, Arab, and Mesopotamian beliefs. The priestly dynasty that served this stone was more influential in Emesa than any Roman governor. They were not mere priests, but true theocratic monarchs, possessing immense wealth and unquestionable authority. Julia Maisa and her family belonged to this line. Her grandson, Varius Avitus Bassianus, the future emperor Elagabalus, was born in 204 AD and was immersed in this atmosphere from early childhood. His father was a Syrian aristocrat, but true power and status were passed down the maternal line through his mother, Julia Soaemias, Julia Maisa's daughter. Thus, 2 powerful forces mingled in the boy's veins: the priestly blood of Emesa's rulers and the imperial blood of the Severan dynasty. It was an explosive cocktail. While his Roman peers studied Virgil and learned to wield a sword, young Bassianus was mastering the mysteries of his cult. His world was one of incense, loud music, ritual chants, and ecstatic dances around the sacred stone. He wore not a toga, but gold-embroidered silk robes. His face was adorned with bright makeup, and a tiara rested on his head. He was not just the heir to the priesthood, he was the central actor in this eternal drama of sun worship. And the shadow of the past, the shadow of his powerful Severan ancestors, woven by his ambitious grandmother, was already hanging over him, preparing him for a destiny he may not have even considered, while spinning in his sacred dance in the temple of his god. In a world where the will of the gods was read in the flight of birds and the entrails of sacrificial animals, prophecies and omens were not just superstitions. They were real political tools. The cult of Elagabalus in Emesa was steeped in mysticism and a belief in predetermination. The central legend held that the black stone, the beetle, was not just a symbol of the god, but the god himself, sent from heaven to rule the earth. Consequently, the high priest was seen not as a mere mortal servant, but as the god's living incarnation, his avatar, chosen for a great mission. The birth of Varius Avitus Bassianus into this environment was framed as an event of cosmic significance. Rumors spread that his mother, Julia Soaemias, had conceived him not by her mortal husband, but by the god Elagabalus himself, or, in a more pragmatic and politically useful version, by her cousin, the Emperor Caracalla, during his time in the East. This second version, cynically engineered by Julia Maisa, would become the cornerstone of her plot. But for the boy himself, immersed in the temple's religious atmosphere, the idea of his divine origin was an absolute truth. He grew up with an awareness of his own exceptionalism, his connection to the heavens. Every ritual, every hymn, every sacrifice reinforced his belief that he was destined for something more than just guarding a sacred stone in a provincial Syrian city. Ancient authors like Herodian report that Bassianus was a youth of extraordinary beauty, and this too was seen as a sign of divine favor. His appearance, his grace in the ritual dances, his charisma, it all worked to create the image of the chosen one. Legends whispered within the temple walls and on the streets of Emesa spoke of a day when the light of the god Elagabalus would illuminate the whole world, and his high priest would sit on the greatest throne on earth. To others, these were vague prophecies. To Julia Maesa, it was a clear plan of action. And to Bassianus himself, it was his undeniable destiny, a reality more tangible than any political circumstance. He didn't just believe in his mission, he was his mission. The future emperor's character was forged not in the harsh conditions of the frontier legions or the cool halls of Senate libraries, but in the suffocating, spicy, mystical atmosphere of the Temple of Elagabalus. His crucible was not Roman discipline, but Syrian religious exaltation. From his earliest years, the life of Varius Avitus Bassianus was subject to a strict but exotic ritual schedule. Instead of studying Latin law and Greek philosophy, he mastered the complex theological doctrines of his cult, memorized ancient hymns in Aramaic, and perfected the art of the ritual dance. Picture the scene: a boy, then a young man, dressed in purple and gold silks, his eyes lined with kohl and his cheeks rouged, wearing a high tiara studded with gems, circling the black idol for hours to the sound of flutes, cymbals, and drums. This was not a performance. It was a form of communion with the divine, a way to enter a trance and feel unity with the cosmos. Such an environment inevitably shaped a unique personality, infinitely distant from the Roman ideal of virtus: courage, restraint, and practicality. While a Roman aristocrat was raised in the cult of ancestors, the state, and military glory, Bassianus was raised in the cult of himself as the god's incarnation. For him, the boundary between human and divine was blurred. He was the god. The god was him. In this worldview, there was also no place for the rigid gender roles of Roman society. In Eastern cults, deities often had androgynous features, and priests might adopt a female appearance during rituals, symbolizing the union of male and female, heaven and earth. What a Roman would consider an indelible disgrace and a sign of perversion, the priest of Elagabalus saw as the highest sacred act. Thus, by the age of 14, Bassianus was not just a teenager. He was a fully formed religious figure, a product of a 1,000-year-old Syrian culture, for whom power was not a political tool, but a theological concept. He was ready to carry the light of his God, but he was completely unprepared to face a world that lived by entirely different laws. The spark that would ignite the fire of a coup was lit by the cold, calculating hand of Julia Maesa. Seeing that Macrinus's rule was causing growing discontent among the troops, especially the legions stationed in the east, who were nostalgic for Caracalla's generosity, she made her first move. Using the colossal wealth accumulated by the priestly dynasty, she began to systematically bribe the soldiers and officers of the 3rd Gallic Legion, quartered near Emesa. But gold was not enough. She needed a powerful, undeniable symbol, a banner for the legions to rally behind. That banner was her 14-year-old grandson. It was then that the brilliant propaganda campaign was launched. Julia Maesa and her daughter, Julia Soemaias, began to spread the rumor that Bassianus was none other than the illegitimate son of the late Emperor Caracalla. They claimed Soemaias had had an affair with the emperor during his stay in Antioch, and that the boy bore a striking resemblance to his real father. It was a brazen but perfectly calculated lie. For the soldiers who despised the low-born Macrinus, the idea of returning a direct descendant of their beloved commander, a son of Severus, to the throne was a breath of fresh air. On the night of May 16th, 218 AD, the plan went into action. Young Bassianus, dressed in lavish robes, was secretly brought to the camp of the 3rd Gallic Legion. There, by torchlight, he was presented to the soldiers as Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, the son of Caracalla, Enormous sums of money were distributed, and by morning, the legionaries had sworn an oath to their new emperor. For the boy, it was the first step out of the world of temple rituals and into the world of brutal politics and war. Yesterday, he was just a high priest dancing before his god. Today, he was a Roman emperor, even if only recognized by a single legion. He passed this first test as little more than a beautiful puppet in his grandmother's hands. But very soon, he would show the world that this puppet had his own terrifying and unyielding will. Behind the glittering facade of the political intrigue orchestrated by Julia Maesa lay the true, deep motivation of Elagabalus himself, the driving force of his short but dazzling reign. It would be a mistake to see him as just a spoiled teenager, drunk on sudden power. His inner world was far more complex and dangerous. His secret motivation, his inner demon, if you will, was not so much a thirst for power in the Roman sense, power as a tool to run the state, wage wars, and grow wealthy, but rather a fanatical, all-consuming conviction in his religious mission. He saw himself not as a successor to Augustus or Trajan, but as a Messiah, a prophet, the avatar of his God, destined to carry out a great spiritual revolution. In his worldview, Rome was not the center of civilization, but a stronghold of darkness and outdated superstitions. Its gods, Jupiter, Mars, Juno, were, to him, just petty tribal idols compared to the universal, all-powerful sun god Elagabalus. His goal was not simply to add his god to the Roman pantheon, as many emperors had done with provincial deities before him. He aimed for a total reprogramming of the empire's entire religious system. He wanted Elagabalus to be the one supreme deity, and all other gods, including Jupiter Capitolinus himself, to be demoted to the level of his servants, angels, or emanations. It was an idea of unheard-of audacity, anticipating Constantine's monotheistic revolution by a century, but it lacked any political wisdom or compromise. He had no intention of persuading or negotiating. He would impose his will, because to him, it was not his will, but the will of the heavens. This fanaticism, combined with the absolute power of an emperor and a total ignorance of Roman political culture, became the explosive mixture that ultimately destroyed him and nearly dragged the entire empire down with him. When Macrinus learned of the Third Gallic Legion's mutiny and the proclamation of a new emperor, he initially dismissed it, calling Elagabalus a pseudo-Antoninus. However, as other Eastern legions began to join the rebels, he realized the gravity of the threat. The decisive clash took place on June 8, 218 AD, near Antioch. Macrinus's army was more experienced, but his soldiers fought reluctantly, without enthusiasm. Meanwhile, the troops of Elagabalus, composed of Syrian legionaries, were inspired by the presence of their divine leader and the generous promises of Julia Maesa. At the height of the battle, just as the rebels seemed to falter, a dramatic turn occurred. The 14-year-old Elagabalus, seeing his troops retreat, drew his sword, and like a hero from an ancient epic, charged into the thick of the fight. Simultaneously, Julia Maesa and Julia Soaemias leaped from their chariots, and weeping, begged the soldiers not to betray the son of their beloved Caracalla. This theatrical but highly effective gesture had its intended effect. The legionaries, shamed by the courage of the women and the boy, turned and struck the enemy with renewed fury. At that same moment, Macrinus's Praetorian prefect, Julianus, was killed, and Macrinus himself, losing his nerve, fled the field disguised as a common soldier. This desertion completely demoralized his army, and many units defected to Elagabalus. The victory was total and unconditional. It was won not by military genius, but by the power of a symbol, the strength of a dynastic legend, and a desperate courage bordering on madness. For the young emperor, this battle was confirmation of his divine election. He had seen with his own eyes how his presence could change the course of history. It strengthened his faith in his mission, and only increased his contempt for the old, rotten order he had so easily crushed. The road to Rome was open. After the victory at Antioch and the swift capture and execution of Macrinus, the entire eastern part of the empire swore allegiance to the new ruler without resistance. News of the 14-year-old son of Caracalla's accession spread through the provinces, provoking a mixed reaction. In the east, where solar cults and the idea of a deified ruler were familiar, his rise to power was met with enthusiasm. Egypt, the wealthiest province, recognized him immediately, ensuring the uninterrupted supply of grain to Rome, a key factor for stability. However, as rumors of the new emperor reached the west, they became increasingly alarming. It was said that he was not a Roman, but a Syrian, not a general, but a priest of an exotic god, that his morals and customs were alien to the Roman spirit. In Rome itself, there was tense anticipation. The Senate, always suspicious of Easterners, was horrified. They had just gotten rid of one barbarian, Macrinus, and now they had to deal with another, even more incomprehensible and foreign. The senators remembered the bloody purges of Caracalla's time and feared a repeat. To calm the capital, letters were sent from Antioch, in which Elagabalus promised to rule in harmony with the Senate, respect the laws, and pass no death sentences without trial. He accepted all the traditional titles, including Father of the Fatherland. On paper, everything looked respectable. However, the geopolitical landscape under his rule had already begun to shift. His accession meant a transfer of the center of power from the west to the east. In his inner circle, key positions were held not by Roman aristocrats, but by Syrians, his countrymen, friends, and relatives. This was not just a change of emperor, it was a change of cultural paradigm. The empire, which for centuries had Latinized and Romanized the East, now faced the reverse process. The East was coming to Rome, not as the conquered, but as the conqueror, bringing its own gods, its own customs, and its own priest-king. It was a tectonic shift, the consequences of which no one could yet fully comprehend. The new emperor's journey from Antioch to Rome took more than a year. It was a leisurely, triumphal procession, during which he wintered in Nicomedia in Asia Minor. It was there, far from the restraining influence of Roman traditions, that Elagabalus made his first and perhaps most fatal strategic error, one that set the tone for his entire reign. Instead of sending the Senate a traditional portrait of himself in a laurel wreath and general's armor, he commissioned a full-length painting and sent it to Rome with orders to hang it in the Curia, the Senate house, directly above the altar of victory, the sacred symbol of the Roman state. In this portrait, he was depicted not as a Roman emperor, but as the high priest of Elagabalus, in his most lavish and exotic vestments. A silk tunic embroidered with gold, a high tiara studded with jewels, his eyes painted and cheeks rouged. He held neither a scepter nor a sword, the symbols of power and justice. Instead, he was making a ritual gesture, offering a sacrifice to his god. For Elagabalus himself, this was an act of supreme honesty, a declaration of his true essence. He was showing Rome who he really was, not a politician, not a general, but a messenger from heaven. He did not want to deceive his subjects by pretending to be something he was not. But for the Roman Senate, this was not just an insult. It was a declaration of cultural and religious war. The sight of this Eastern magician taking the place of the goddess of victory caused shock and revulsion. Looking at that image, the senators saw everything the Roman spirit despised: effeminacy, barbaric opulence, the rejection of a masculine appearance, and the replacement of military valor with priestly rituals. This portrait became the visual manifesto of his future rule. He was not going to assimilate. He was going to assimilate Rome. It was a colossal tactical blunder because it turned the entire political elite against him in advance, leaving him not a single chance for compromise. The war was declared before he even set foot on Italian soil. Arriving at last in Rome in the autumn of 219, Elagabalus found himself at the center of a complex web of alliances and enmities. His closest and most important circle of support was his own family, the so-called Syrian princesses. The main figure here, without a doubt, was his grandmother, Julia Maesa. Experienced, powerful, and pragmatic, she was the true Grey Cardinal of the dynasty. She was the one who had organized the plot, brought her grandson to power, and was now trying to steer his relentless energy in a direction acceptable to the Romans. She understood the need to maintain at least an outward appearance of decency, and tried to be the bridge between her exotic grandson and the hostile Roman establishment. Beside her stood the emperor's mother, Julia Soaemias. Unlike her calculating mother, Soaemias was completely under her son's influence. She did not restrain, but rather encouraged his religious fanaticism and extravagant behavior. Ancient historians describe her as a woman wholly absorbed in orgiastic cults and uninterested in state affairs. She was not an advisor, but an accomplice. But if his family was his support, the main and most powerful enemy of Elagabalus was not a specific person, but the entire Roman ruling class, the Senate. To the senators, he was a foreigner, a barbarian, and a tyrant who had usurped power. They despised his origins, his religion, his manners. Every step he took that contradicted the mos maiorum, the customs of the ancestors, only intensified their hatred. Another important force to be reckoned with was the Praetorian Guard. These elite soldiers had brought him to power, bribed with gold and the name of Caracalla. But their loyalty was fickle. They were pragmatists, and their allegiance belonged to whoever paid the most and guaranteed stability. As long as Elagabalus rewarded them generously, they tolerated him. But their Roman self-awareness and warriors' pride were constantly offended by the sight of an emperor who behaved like a priest and a woman. Thus, Elagabalus was trapped. His only true allies were the women of his family, and his enemy was the entire world he ruled. Once in Rome, Elagabalus faced a fundamental choice that defined his fate. He could have followed the path laid by the first emperor, Augustus, a path of hypocrisy and compromise. Augustus, while holding absolute power, had formally preserved all republican institutions, showed respect to the Senate, and positioned himself not as a monarch, but as first among equals. This path would have allowed Elagabalus to gradually integrate his cult into Roman life, find allies in the Senate, and strengthen his rule. But there was another path, that of a Hellenistic monarch, a god-king in the tradition of Alexander the Great, or the Egyptian pharaohs. This path meant rejecting the republican fiction, establishing an open theocratic autocracy, and directly imposing his will. For a young man who had believed in his divine nature since childhood and had just won a triumphant victory, the first path seemed cowardly and unworthy. He chose the second without hesitation. His first step was not to build relationships with the senators, but to begin a grandiose construction project. On the Palatine Hill, in the very heart of Rome, next to the imperial palaces, he ordered the construction of a magnificent temple dedicated to his god, the Elagabalus. This act was a challenge in itself. The Palatine was a sacred place, linked to the founding of Rome, to Romulus and the Vestal Virgins. Building a temple to a foreign god here was tantamount to desecrating a holy site. But Elagabalus went further. He didn't just build a temple. He planned to turn it into the center of all religious life in the empire. He ordered the most sacred relics of Rome to be transferred to the Elagabalus, the Palladium, the statue of Athena supposedly brought from Troy, the sacred shields of Mars, the fire of Vesta. His idea was to gather all the gods under one roof, not as equals, but as subordinates to the great Elagabalus. This was the moment of his final, irreversible break with Roman tradition. He was not trying to fit into the system. He decided to break it and build his own upon its ruins. Elagabalus reached the zenith of his power, and simultaneously the peak of his hubris, with the completion of the Elagabalus. The culmination of his religious revolution was a grand ceremony to transfer the sacred black stone from its temporary storage to its new home on the Palatine. It was a spectacle the likes of which Rome had never seen, and it was choreographed to demonstrate the humiliation of the old gods and the triumph of the new. The stone was placed in a gilded chariot, pulled by 6 pure white horses. The emperor himself, dressed in his most luxurious priestly robes, walked backwards in front of the chariot, his eyes never leaving his deity. He held the reins, but was led as if he were not guiding the horses, but as if the god were guiding his high priest. The streets were strewn with flowers, incense burned everywhere, and along the entire route, altars were set up for hecatombs, mass sacrifices of bulls and sheep. But most shocking for the Romans was that Elagabalus forced the entire upper class of Rome, senators, equestrians, priests of the old cults, to participate in this barbaric procession. They had to run alongside the chariot, carrying torches and images of their own gods, thereby publicly acknowledging their subordinate status. The climax of this event was the rituals in the Elagabalus itself. There, before the black cone, the emperor personally performed sacrifices, accompanied by ecstatic dances to the sound of Syrian music. He forced the Roman nobility to attend these ceremonies, during which, according to rumors, human sacrifices were also made. Children from noble families were sacrificed to read their entrails. The pinnacle of his theological construct was the declaration that Jupiter, the thunderer, head of the Roman pantheon, was nothing more than a doorman or servant to his sun god. With this, he challenged more than just tradition. He challenged the very foundation of Roman identity, the very sky over Rome. And the sky, in the form of the Roman people and the army, was preparing to answer. After Elagabalus established his god at the pinnacle of the Roman pantheon, he decided that a sacred marriage was necessary for the complete fusion of the Syrian and Roman worlds. And so he arranged a wedding for his god. As a bride for the black stone of Elagabalus, he chose not some minor goddess, but the purest and most inviolable thing in Roman religion, the goddess Vesta, guardian of the hearth and the sacred fire of Rome. Since the goddess herself could not attend the ceremony, a human had to represent her. And Elagabalus committed an act that plunged Rome into a state of profound shock. He himself married one of the Vestal virgins, Aquilia Severa. The Vestals were priestesses of Vesta who took a 30-year vow of celibacy and virginity. Breaking this vow was considered one of the most heinous crimes and was punishable by a horrific death. The Vestal was buried alive in an underground chamber. The emperor, as the Pontifex Maximus, was the guarantor of this vow's sanctity. And now, this very high pontiff not only entered into a relationship with a Vestal, but publicly took her as his wife, holding a lavish wedding. He explained his actions from a theological standpoint. It was, he claimed, an ideal union, a marriage of a priest and a priestess, from which God-like children would be born. But for the Romans, this was not just sacrilege. It was the rape of their city's very soul. The sacred fire of Vesta, which had burned for centuries and symbolized the eternity of Rome, had been defiled. This marriage became the first deep crack in the foundation of his power. If his eccentricities had previously provoked contempt and ridicule, they now began to inspire fear and hatred. The people, who could forgive an emperor for cruelty or debauchery, could not forgive him for spitting in the face of their most sacred beliefs. The grumbling, which until then had only been heard in the halls of the Senate, was now heard on the streets of Rome. The harbingers of a storm were gathering over the young emperor's head, but he, intoxicated by his divine status, did not notice them. If the marriage to the Vestal was an act of religious sacrilege, the next step Elagabalus took was a total break with Rome's social and gender identity, a turning point after which his fall became only a matter of time. He began to publicly declare that he was not a man, but a woman. This was not just eccentric behavior, but a consistent and deliberate transformation of his identity. He stopped responding to his male name and demanded to be addressed as lady or empress. He fully adopted a female style of dress, wearing expensive silks and wigs, using cosmetics, and shaving his body hair. He spoke openly of his desire to change his sex and, according to Cassius Dio, offered enormous sums of money to any physician who could perform surgery to create female genitalia. His palaces were allegedly transformed into brothels, where he would play the role of a prostitute, soliciting customers and haggling over the price. He entered into a public marriage with one of his favorites, a former slave and charioteer from Caria named Hierocles. At this wedding, Elagabalus played the role of the bride, calling Hierocles his husband and master. He even complained that his husband beat him and would show off his bruises, just as Roman matrons did. For the Roman consciousness, built on the cult of masculinity, virtues, this was unthinkable. The emperor, the supreme commander of the armies, the father of the fatherland, was not just behaving like a woman. He was striving to become one, publicly humiliating his male status. This was something more than the sexual licentiousness Rome had seen before. It was a metaphysical rebellion against the very order of the world. In his own theology, this might have made some sense. He could have seen himself as the earthly incarnation of a mother goddess, the consort of his sun god. But for the Romans, this was the final, irreversible diagnosis. Their emperor was a madman, a pervert, a monster, shaming the name of Rome. From this moment on, he ceased to be just a bad ruler. He became a threat to the very existence of Roman civilization. All this time, Julia Maesa watched her grandson's insane antics with growing horror. This Iron Lady, who had placed him on the throne with her will and her gold, now saw all her work turning to dust. She understood what Elagabalus did not. Power in Rome rested not only on legions, but on tradition, on respect for the customs of the ancestors. By destroying these traditions, her grandson was sawing off the branch he was sitting on. She tried to reason with him, to persuade him to be more discreet, but her admonitions hit a wall of religious fanaticism and adolescent stubbornness. Realizing that Elagabalus was a lost cause and his fall was inevitable, the pragmatic and ruthless Maesa made a decision. If this grandson could not be saved, then the dynasty must be, and she began to prepare his replacement. She had another grandson, the son of her second daughter, Julia Mamaea. His name was Bassianus Alexander, and he was the complete opposite of his cousin. He was about 13 years old and had received an excellent Roman education. He was modest, reserved, respectful to his elders, and interested not in ecstatic dances, but in literature and military affairs. He was the ideal candidate to calm the Senate and the army. Julia Maesa began her last and most dangerous political game. She started to systematically promote Alexander, presenting him at court, introducing him to influential senators, and, most importantly, to the officers of the Praetorian Guard. She spread rumors that it was Alexander, not Elagabalus, who was the true son of Caracalla. She created a contrast. Here was the mad, effeminate, alien Syrian, and here was the noble, masculine, truly Roman youth. She began to redirect financial flows, showering gifts on those Praetorians who showed sympathy for Alexander. She was playing with fire. She was plotting against her own grandson, whom she herself had made emperor, and risking everything. But she knew that the ship named Elagabalus was sinking, and she had to get into the lifeboat named Alexander Severus before she was dragged into the abyss along with the mad captain. While Julia Maesa was weaving her web, the court of Elagabalus devolved into a theater of the absurd, where the leading roles were played not by experienced administrators and celebrated generals, but by the most base and despised characters in Roman society. The emperor, completely ignoring the affairs of state, which he had delegated to his mother and grandmother, surrounded himself with an entourage of actors, dancers, gladiators, and charioteers. These were the men who became his closest advisors and were given access to the highest offices in the empire. The chief figure in this cabinet of favorites was his husband, the charioteer Heracles. This former slave held limitless power over the emperor, publicly humiliated and beat him, and yet enjoyed all the privileges of an empress. Another influential lover was Aurelius Zodicus, an athlete from Smyrna, whom the emperor appointed as his chamberlain. According to historians, Zodicus was brought to Rome with great pomp and immediately married to the emperor. However, his career was short-lived. He was soon exiled from the palace due to the intrigues of a jealous Heracles. But favoritism was not limited to the bedroom. Elagabalus appointed his drinking buddies and lovers, men with no experience or education, as praetorian prefects, consuls, and provincial governors. The vital post of prefect of the Annona, responsible for Rome's grain supply, was given to a charioteer, and command of the city watch to a barber named Claudius. Posts in the Senate and the equestrian order were openly bought and sold. Corruption reached unprecedented levels, for the Roman aristocracy, which had spent centuries preparing its sons to govern the state. This was the final humiliation. To see former slaves, gladiators, and dancers occupy the posts that should have been theirs by birth and merit was unbearable. The court of Elagabalus became a symbol of complete decay and the inversion of all social hierarchies. It was not just tyranny, it was a carnival, one that had dragged on for 4 years and threatened to consume the entire empire. Against the backdrop of religious scandals and political chaos at court, the economic and administrative state of the empire deteriorated rapidly. Elagabalus, absorbed in his rituals and personal pleasures, showed not the slightest interest in the routine but vital work of governing. The burden of power fell effectively on Julia Maesa, but even her iron will was not enough to compensate for her grandson's destructive activities. The imperial treasury, already depleted by wars and the generosity of Caracalla, was subjected to unprecedented plunder. Enormous funds were spent on building the Elagabalium, organizing lavish religious ceremonies, purchasing exotic animals for sacrifice, and, of course, maintaining the bloated court of favorites. To cover these expenses, Elagabalus resorted to the most cynical methods. A system of openly selling public offices was introduced. Anyone who could pay could become a senator, a governor, or an army officer. This led to incompetent but wealthy crooks taking key posts, who viewed their positions solely as a way to recoup their investment and get rich at the expense of the provincials. Taxes rose sharply, but the collected funds did not go to the needs of the state. They settled in the pockets of the emperor's favorites. The administrative system, carefully built over centuries, began to fail. The courts did not function, roads were not repaired, and the army's supply lines worsened. In Rome itself, grain shortages began, which was always a harbinger of popular unrest. The empire, that complex organism, began to crack at the seams. The provinces, left unsupervised, became easy prey for corrupt governors and external enemies. While the emperor danced before his black stone, asking it for cosmic harmony, his earthly kingdom was sinking into chaos and anarchy. It was a reign in which form had completely replaced substance, and ritual had replaced real governance. Gradually, the cup of patience overflowed, not only for the aristocracy, but for the common people of Rome. The plebs, who had at first watched the exotic processions with curiosity and were happy with the generous handouts from the new emperor, soon felt the consequences of his rule. Rising prices, food shortages, the outrageous behavior of the emperor's favorites, and, most importantly, the constant insult to their religious feelings turned the people against Elagabalus. The Romans were superstitious. They believed that crop failures, floods, and epidemics were the anger of the gods for violating the established order. And the reign of Elagabalus was one continuous violation. His marriage to a Vestal, the transfer of sacred relics, the humiliation of Jupiter, all of this, in the eyes of the common Roman, brought a divine curse upon the city. Discontent began to spill out into the open. Insulting graffiti appeared on walls, and people sang satirical songs about the emperor and his husband, Heracles. Conspiracies began to form. But the main force on which the emperor's fate depended remained the Praetorian Guard. And it was here that Julia Maesa's propaganda was bearing fruit. The Praetorians, professional soldiers, looked upon their effeminate commander-in-chief with growing disgust each day. They saw him humiliate Roman traditions, and they saw his cousin, Alexander, growing up beside him, a modest, masculine youth who looked like a true Roman. The soldiers began to openly compare the two cousins, and the comparison was clearly not in Elagabalus's favor. Unrest began to stir in the barracks. The guards' loyalty, bought with gold, began to melt under the influence of cultural shock and skillful agitation. They had sworn an oath to Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, son of Caracalla, but they had gotten a Syrian priest who called himself a woman. They felt deceived, and they were ready to wash away this deception with blood. Julia Maesa, seeing that the ground was ripe for a coup, decided to act. She understood that simply killing Elagabalus and replacing him with Alexander was risky. It could provoke a civil war. A legitimate transition of power had to be ensured. Using all her influence on her grandson, and perhaps playing on his vanity, she convinced him to adopt his cousin and proclaim him Caesar, that is, junior co-ruler and heir. She justified the move by arguing that it was improper for Elagabalus, as high priest, to occupy himself with worldly affairs like war and administration. Let Alexander, she suggested, take over this routine work, so the emperor could devote himself fully to serving his god. Elagabalus, either giving in to her persuasions or not seeing the 13-year-old cousin as a serious threat, agreed. In 221 AD, a formal ceremony was held in which Bassianus Alexander received the name Alexander Severus and the title of Caesar. This act was presented to Rome as a great blessing. It was meant to symbolize the stability of the dynasty and calm all sectors of society. The Senate was ecstatic. They had their Caesar, raised in Roman traditions. The people in the army also welcomed the appointment. It seemed that the wise Julia Maesa had found the perfect compromise to save both the dynasty and the empire. However, she had underestimated one thing: the pathological jealousy and unpredictability of her elder grandson. Elagabalus very quickly realized that he had not created an assistant, but a rival. He saw how the universal affection, which had previously been directed at him, even if with disgust, now streamed toward his young heir. And this awoke in him not the wisdom of a ruler, but the fury of a capricious deity from whom someone had dared to steal a part of his glory. The peace did not last long. Elagabalus burned with jealousies as he watched Alexander's popularity grow. Senators openly showed respect to the Caesar, and soldiers greeted him with enthusiasm, while the Augustus himself was met with icy silence. For the narcissistic nature of Elagabalus, this was unbearable. He realized he had been tricked, and that Alexander was not his heir, but his gravedigger. And he decided to act. First, he tried to humiliate his cousin, forbidding his tutors from teaching him subjects worthy of a Roman aristocrat. Then he began to spread rumors that Alexander was gravely ill and near death, trying to test society's reaction. The reaction was immediate. The Praetorians demanded to see their beloved Caesar, threatening to riot. Elagabalus was forced to comply. Realizing that simple intrigues would not work, he moved to direct action. He made several attempts to physically eliminate Alexander. He sent assassins, tried to poison him. But every one of these attempts failed, as Alexander was under the constant protection of his mother, Julia Mamaea, and Praetorians loyal to him. Moreover, each failed assassination attempt only strengthened Alexander's popularity and intensified the hatred for Elagabalus. He was transforming from the savior of the dynasty into a brother killer, a new Caligula. The gulf between the two cousins became unbridgeable. The court split into two factions. The atmosphere was electrified. Everyone understood that an open clash was inevitable, and that only one of them would survive. Elagabalus, in his blindness, decided to go all in, not understanding that all his cards had already been beaten. The final straw that broke the Praetorian Guard's patience was Elagabalus's open attempt to strip Alexander of his title of Caesar and all his honors. He gave an order to erase his cousin's name from all official documents and forbade him from appearing in public. When the Praetorians learned of this, they were furious. They saw it not as a palace intrigue, but as a personal insult and a violation of the oath they had sworn. The soldiers refused their duties and barricaded themselves in their camp, declaring they would not come out until Emperor Elagabalus and Caesar Alexander appeared before them together. This was open mutiny. Elagabalus, rattled, first tried to ignore their demand, but under pressure from his mother and grandmother, he was forced to concede. He realized his power was hanging by a thread, and that thread was the loyalty of the Guard, which he had, it seemed, finally lost. The moment of truth had arrived. In March 222 AD, the Imperial procession, consisting of the two warring factions, made its way to the Praetorian camp. It was a scene full of dark symbolism. On one side, the 18-year-old Elagabalus, in his lavish robes, surrounded by his entourage of dancers and eunuchs. On the other, the 13-year-old Alexander, in a modest toga, accompanied by his mother and loyal officers. This was not just an appearance of rulers before their troops. It was a trial, where the common soldiers were the judges, and the stakes were life and power. The courtyard of the Praetorian camp became the stage for the final act of this tragedy. As soon as the two cousins appeared before the ranks, the soldiers held an impromptu vote. They greeted Alexander with deafening cheers, chanting his name and praising his virtues. Elagabalus, however, was met with a dead, contemptuous silence. This scene, resembling a grotesque beauty contest, finally made the emperor snap. In a fit of rage, unable to bear such humiliation, he pointed to several Praetorians who were cheering Alexander with particular vigor and ordered his personal guard to arrest them for insulting the emperor's majesty. This was his last and most fatal mistake. He had forgotten the primary lesson every Roman emperor should have learned. Never, under any circumstances, enter into open conflict with the Praetorians on their own territory. His order for their arrest was like a starting pistol. For the guards, it was a signal that he was trying to rob them not only of their beloved Caesar, but of their own right to a voice. They saw this act as the beginning of reprisals and purges, and they decided to strike first. The order for arrest was the spark that ignited the powder keg. The Praetorians, defending their comrades, drew their swords and rushed the emperor's small security detail. A massacre began. The entourage of Elagabalus, consisting of actors and eunuchs, was cut down in the first few minutes. The emperor himself, seeing the deadly turn of events, panicked and fled. Together with his mother, Julia Soaemias, he tried to hide in one of the camp's buildings. Alexander and his mother, Julia Mamaia, by contrast, were immediately taken under the protection of loyal soldiers and led to safety. The camp descended into chaos. Enraged soldiers, drunk on blood and the promise of plunder, split into groups and began to sweep the barracks, hunting for the deposed tyrant. They were looking not only for him, but for his closest associates. Heracles, the emperor's husband, and other hated favorites were caught and torn to pieces on the spot. The hunt for Elagabalus himself turned into a cruel and humiliating chase. The man who, just an hour before, had considered himself a god on earth, now darted through the filthy corridors of the barracks like a cornered animal. All his divine majesty, all his priestly charisma, vanished in an instant, leaving only a teenager, terrified to death, desperately clinging to life. The movement toward the end became as inexorable as a Greek tragedy, where the hero, blinded by pride, creates all the conditions for his own demise. In a desperate attempt to save himself, Elagabalus and his mother, Julia Soaemias, hid in a chest, which, according to one version, was located in the camp latrine. This choice of hiding place became the final, most humiliating detail of his biography, a bitter irony of fate. The high priest of the sun god, who built temples of pure gold and surrounded himself with refined luxury, ended his journey in filth. But even this refuge did not save them. The soldiers, combing every corner, found the fugitives. They were dragged from the chest and presented to the judgment of the furious crowd. There could be no question of mercy. The sentence was passed and carried out immediately. First, Julia Soaemias was killed, trying to shield her son to the very end. Then came the turn of Elagabalus himself. The one who called himself Lady, who dreamed of a woman's body, met a death that, in Roman eyes, was the most manly, by the swords of his own soldiers. But simply killing them was not enough for the Praetorians. They needed to destroy the very memory of them, to unleash all their accumulated hatred. From that moment, what the Romans called a posthumous execution began. Death was not the end of the humiliation for Elagabalus and his mother. Their bodies were beheaded, and the soldiers, mounting their heads on pikes, carried them with triumphant cries through the camp and then through the streets of Rome. It was a barbaric spectacle, designed to demonstrate the tyrant's complete and final downfall. Then their naked and mutilated bodies were tied with ropes and dragged through the city. The crowd, which had recently watched his sacred processions with awe, now threw stones and filth at the dead bodies, jeering and cursing. First, they tried to throw them into the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's main sewer system. The symbolism was obvious. He who had defiled the city should end his journey in its wastewater. However, the body of Elagabalus was too large and would not fit into the opening of the drain. So the mob dragged them further, to the Tiber River. There, Stones were tied to the bodies, so they would never surface and could not be properly buried, and they were thrown from a bridge into the murky water. For a Roman to be deprived of burial was the most terrible curse, dooming the soul to wander forever. Thus ended the life of the young man who wanted to be a god. He received neither divine honors nor even a simple human burial. His path ended at the bottom of a river, in oblivion and shame, as if the very soil of Rome had spit him out, refusing to accept him. Immediately after the assassination of Elagabalus, the Senate, which had been living in fear, enthusiastically got to work. First, Alexander Severus was proclaimed the new emperor, with real power concentrated in the hands of his mother, Julia Mamaea, and grandmother, Julia Maesa. Then followed the act of damnatio memoriae, damnation of memory, against the deposed tyrant. This was a standard Roman procedure, applied to the most hated rulers. The name of Elagabalus was ordered to be erased from all official documents, inscriptions on buildings, and monuments. His statues and portraits were to be destroyed. The sacred black stone was sent back to Emesa. The Elagabalium was rededicated to Jupiter the Avenger. A systematic attempt was made to totally erase his 4-year reign from history, as if it had never happened. But it was impossible to erase the memory completely. On the contrary, historians who were contemporary to the events, such as Cassius Dio and Herodian, took up their pens to create his literary portrait, and they did not spare the black ink. In their works, Elagabalus appears not just as a bad emperor, but as an absolute monster, the embodiment of all conceivable vices. He was depicted as the most depraved, the most cruel, the most insane of all tyrants, surpassing even Caligula and Nero in his baseness. It was this image, created by his enemies, that became canonical and endured for almost 2 millennia. He became the archetype of the Oriental despot, a symbol of decay and depravity, a convenient boogeyman for moralists of all subsequent eras. His real story, the story of a tragic clash between 2 incompatible cultures, was drowned in a flood of propaganda, leaving behind only the caricature of a perverted tyrant. Now, looking at his entire life from beginning to bloody end, we can try to give a final answer to the main question: how and why did this happen? The key to the central paradox of his reign is that Elagabalus was most likely not a cynical manipulator or clinically insane. He was a true believer, a product of his unique cultural and religious environment. His tragedy is the tragedy of a total, absolute cultural misunderstanding, a clash of 2 civilizational codes that had no common ground. He grew up in a world where the ruler was a living god, where religious ecstasy was the highest form of spirituality, and where gender roles were fluid and subject to mythological logic. When he received absolute power over Rome, he did not play by Roman rules because he simply did not know them or understand their value. He tried to remake Rome in his own image, sincerely believing he was bringing the light of true faith to savage and superstitious barbarians. All of his insane actions were perfectly logical within his own worldview. The marriage to the Vestal was a sacred union of priest and priestess. Moving all the gods to his temple was the creation of a single, harmonious pantheon. And his transformation into a woman was the highest mystical act of merging with the divine, becoming the consort of the sun god. He was not trying to offend the Romans. He was trying to save them, to elevate them. But for Rome, with its cult of law, order, masculine virtue, and pragmatic approach to religion, this was tantamount to an invasion by an alien virus. The pragmatic political organism of Rome rejected this foreign theocratic implant, destroying it with utter brutality. He failed to become a reformer or even a proper tyrant. He remained in history as what he had always been, the high priest from Emesa, who by mistake occupied the throne of a Roman emperor for 4 years. The story of Elagabalus, when cleansed of centuries of propaganda, is not just an anecdote about a bad emperor, but an eternal and terrifying warning. It is a story about how fragile the most powerful empires can be when their foundations are attacked not from without, but from within by their own leader. It is a parable about the mortal danger that comes from merging absolute political power with absolute, uncompromising religious faith. Elagabalus was not a politician using religion for his own ends. He was a fanatic using politics to assert his faith, and that was his fundamental mistake. His story is a mirror reflecting the eternal struggle between tradition and revolution, between the established order and the charismatic leader who wants to tear everything down and rebuild from scratch. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What is normal, and what is deviance? Who defines the boundaries of the permissible? And what happens when one culture tries to forcibly impose its value system on another? Ultimately, the tale of the 14-year-old priest who became emperor and declared himself a goddess is a profoundly human tragedy. It is the story of a teenager, burdened with the weight of the world, who, having no tools other than his faith, tried to remake that world in his own image, only to be torn apart by it. It is a reminder that even gods, especially those who live among mortals, are mortal, and their fall from heaven to earth can be a terrible and instructive spectacle.